all. Welcome to Lore Talks. I'm Elio Forcheron.
I'm Niniri Niri.
And we are here today to talk about the modern history of Thanalan, using Ul'dah as a linchpin, much like we did with Belladia and the early history of Thanalan.
Exactly, that's right. Ul'dah is central to Thanalan, as we understand it.
Yeah, and as inheritor to the legacy of those civilizations that came before, it's simultaneously, it's referred to as the jewel of the desert and is the heart of the desert as we know it now, but it is a stepping stone in a much longer lineage, as we've shown thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. A big theme in this game is all about, the lineages of history and how history interacts with certain peoples and groups.
Yeah, you can see it with the likes of, Gelmora and Gridania.
Yeah, and Garlemald and their experiences in the past.
Absolutely. So then, let's dive in. Piggybacking off of where we were at the end, I think it's probably best that we give an overview on the what's, where's, and whys of Ul'dah, and then continue from the timeline we had set forth.
Right, exactly. I agree with you.
Well then, what is Ul'dah, for those who are unaware?
So Ul'dah is one of the premier nations of Aldenard, which is the continent that Eorzean is on. It's a plutocracy hidden under the guise of a monarchy, a plutocracy being a state run by the wealthy. It's ruled by the ancient Ul dynasty. Some would say the second Ul dynasty, but it's the same bloodline. The true power, however, is held by a collective of vastly wealthy citizens known as the Syndicate. The nation is both a military power, largely through large armies of mercenaries in cooperation with their grand company, the Eternal Flames.
Immortal Flames?
Immortal Flames. And one of the world's greatest trading nations, dominating overland trade across Aldenard and taking a good hand in the naval trade across the entire world. This is largely, though not entirely, helmed by Lolorito Nanarito, one of the Syndicate's most powerful members, if not the most powerful member, and chairman of the East Aldenard Trading Company. It's really heavily influenced by real-world Persian and Arabic and Egyptian and even Anatolian elements.
Yeah, and to your point on Lolorito, we have other people on the Syndicate, like Fergus or Dulala, but all of their interests and their control seems isolated to Thanalan proper, and so I agree with you. I think Lolorito's by far the most powerful. His only rival once upon a time would have been Teleji, really.
Yeah, I would say his only rivals were Teleji and were Raubahn, and both of them are now off the Syndicate, of course.
Yeah, and as a monetarist, Raubahn had a very different role in it all.
Yes, he did.
Where then is Ul'dah located?
So Ul'dah and its holdings, because it's not really a city-state, I've said this before, the city-states of Eorzea aren't actually really city-states. They're central cities that control an entire nation, so they're a capital city, essentially. Ul'dah and its holdings functionally dominate the south of Eorzea. They carve out these vast lands amid the arid lands of Thanalan. Overland, it's bordered by Mordona to the north, Pagalthan to the northeast, and Cartano to the northwest. It shares a naval border with the state of Limsa on Vilbrand to the west via the Rotano Sea.
Yeah, and with the Sea of Ash to its south, correct?
Yeah, the Sea of Ash. There's not any grand nation that it borders on that side. If you go farther enough north, then you could reach Alamigo, of course.
Yeah, interestingly, too, not only do you have to sort of pass through the Black Shroud to reach Alamigo, but its proximity to Mordona also means it has a proximity to the famed Saltmoor. And since, Mach kind of ties into its history in a long-winded, winding road, that's also fascinating in its own right.
It is fascinating, you're right. There is definitely a migration path that you could trace there.
So when did Ul'dah come to be?
So the cultural legacy that forms Ul'dah first begins in the 5th Astral Era with the rise of the powerful majocratic nation of Mark, far to the northwest, well, not that far, but far to the northwest in the riverine basin of Euphame. When Mark fell, certain hardline elements of the nation survived in exile and eventually went on to found the nation of Belladia, like we talked about, in 737 of the 6th Astral Era, roughly 8 centuries ago. Belladia went on to fuse its culture, its Marquee culture, with certain hallmarks of the culture that had formed around the worship of the sun goddess Azema, which seems to have been a major component in creating the culture that we see in Ul'dah today. Ul'dah itself was, as a nation, was born pretty directly out of the schism experienced by Belediah in 964 of the 6th Astral Era.
Known as the War of the Sisters, right?
Yeah. War of the Sisters, that's right. In which two princes of the nation waged a bloody civil war, and the kingdom of Belediah just splintered into two nations, Ul'dah and Sil'dih, like we discussed in the previous video.
Just worth pointing out, the War of the Sisters is not in reference, obviously, to the ruling sisters because they were princes. It is in reference to the city-states themselves, which have typically been referenced with feminine pronouns.
Yeah, like most nations in real life, although not all, the states of Sil'dih and Ul'dah are referred to by feminine terms.
So who makes up the majority of Ul'dah's populace?
So the predominant racial groups of Ul'dah are the Dunesfolk Lalafell, who seem to have emerged as a group specifically in Belediah and Ul'dah, as well as a large number of Midlander here. Both of these groups were present in Mark, so we would see why they would make up such a prominent basis in Ul'dah, as well as the Huron migrations from Ilzabar that sort of dominated the early 6th Astral. Together, these two groups make up about 70% of Ul'dah, with the balance being skewed a little bit in the favor of the Lalafell. But there are also large populations of Highlander here and Hellsguard Rogadin, which make up about 20% of the population each, divided more equally, than the Lalafells and the Midlanders are. These populations that we know of actually don't stem from the Alamegan refugee crisis because we don't have numbers for post Alamigo Ul'dah populations. Instead, they come from Ul'dah hiring large amounts of mercenaries from Girabania and the rest of Abalathia's spine and settling them in their nation, much like many countries did in real life. Egypt springs to mind. If we do get another census, for example, another source book or something that gives us some more population details, I would expect to see the Highlander populations of Ul'dah explode.
As a byproduct of the refugees of the Calamity in Alamigo?
Right, exactly. And I'm sure that many of them have gone back, but I would be surprised if there were not still significant populations in Ul'dah.
Yeah, it depends on how you want to read the locations like Little Alamigo and what groups might have not integrated versus fully integrated.
Yeah, and I mean, although Little Alamigo was a cultural sort of heartland for the Alamegans, we know that there was a great deal of them in the city, enough that the rich of the city wanted to move out of the city, actually. So I would imagine it's quite a complex diaspora.
Yeah, very much so. And it's really interesting how the Hellsguard populate it as well, because it's probably the largest source of their people outside of the Far Reach in the northern section of Abalathia's spine. And the irony being that it is the southernmost tip of Aldenard, but probably maybe fitting with the fact that the Hellsguard Rogadin seem to really love inhospitable places.
Well, definitely. And I mean, if you want to hire mercenaries, the Hellsguard are damn fine mercenaries to hire.
Yeah, I mean, if you assume that the Ilsabardian Rogadin are offshoots of the Hellsguard Rogadin, then even the Garleans were hiring mercenaries, Rogadin mercenaries, to change the tide of many, many different battles throughout the 6th Astral Era.
Right, exactly. And they're both mountain-dwelling Rogadin peoples. They both use magics, plausibly thaumaturgy, and they're both they've both served as mercenaries for other nations. So yeah, just like you said, there is definitely a link between the Ilsabardian and Hellsguard Rogadins, even if only thematically.
So why has Ul'dah been so successful, and why has it continued to thrive? Both in the fact that it is in such a harsh climate in contrast to some of the other Eorzean city-states, but also with the constant push and pull for its soul, as it were.
Right, exactly. So, like you said, the main threats to Ul'dah have come from within. Outside of Sil'dih and internal conflict, and to a lesser degree Garlemald, because Ul'dah doesn't seem to have been the most affected by the Garlean invasions thus far, before we stopped them. Besides northern Thanalan.
Yeah, we only really have Cape Westwind, which is close in proximity and harasses Ul'dah, but the thing is that because Vesper Bay still functions even in the shadow of Castrum Marinum, it doesn't seem to be a major problem. And while the issues around the control for Ceruleum in the north are a major threat, they're more of a major threat to all of Eorzea than they are Ul'dah specifically.
Yes, definitely. And Ul'dah, of course, in these matters had the support of the other city-states. If I had to pick a nation that was most affected, I would probably say Gridania, because we see some pretty heavy stuff going on in Gridania at the hands of the Garleans.
Yeah, well, you also look at Baelsar's Wall. I mean, obviously, if you're ignoring Alamigo, right? Like,
Oh,
you
yeah,
have to
yeah.
admit. But you look at Baelsar's Wall, you look at things surrounding that. The fact that life seems to go on in Lenosia, right? You have literally a castrum right next to
Oh, Costa del Sol.
Costa del Sol, yeah. You have that castrum right next to Costa del Sol, and yet everything seems fine. It's an interesting relationship they all seem to have.
It is, yeah. So Ul'dah has a number of things going for it. They have a mastery of thaumaturgy. They have pretty much the death grip on Eorzean alchemy and certain arenas of craftsmanship. They have huge mineral wealth, of course. But I suspect that a major component in the prosperity of Ul'dah came from the Thorne dynasty, who guided the nation into an economic juggernaut by placing it in control of much of Eorzea's overland trade routes and working to make its markets a desirable place to go on Aldenard.
A control that they still have to this day.
They certainly do. And you could debate how well that's actually turned out for Ul'dah, of course. I think as a nation, it probably did help them a good deal, but it is going to present problems in the form of the syndicates later on, of course.
Yeah, and it's going to become that issue of the accrual of power and systems set up to not inhibit and promote it, and just each of the Eorzean city-states have their own fundamental difficulties and legacy, be it the xenophobia inherent to the Shroud, to Gridania, or Limsa and its piratery. But Ul'dah, I think, plays maybe the most center stage, especially when you look at content like the 2.x series.
Yes. Yeah, and I think we're going to get some pretty big focus on Nanamo's plan to turn it into a republic as well.
Ever hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking this for a while now, but in terms of the Renaissance Republic, Ul'dah already is one, because Renaissance Republic was ran by, a board of business owners, essentially. But, they've got a ways to go before they reach true democracy.
Yeah, at least the one benefit is there is, from the inception, from the moment that we get anything with Ul'dah, it is a push and pull for its soul. It is not, this is a place that must be fucked. There are people fighting for it tooth and claw to try and make it better, and some people who are despairing, some people who are willing to take advantage of it. And so that, the fact that it is this contrast and this push and pull is why it's interesting, rather than something to just be purely, not that it shouldn't be decried, but it's more compelling.
Yeah, and I mean, although obviously the syndicate, at least in the majority, the Stone Torches and Amagina and Sons and the East Aldenard Trading Company and all of that, they seem to be somewhat immoral when you first look at them. But I'm sure that the quality of life in Ul'dah for the vast majority of people have improved by the Thorne dynasty's increased focus on mercantilism, and then the second Old Dynasty's continued focus on that. So it's not all one side of the coin.
And when they have been responsible for alchemical and mechanical evolution as well. One of the interesting things too is you can look to some of the narratives that we see with Lolorito, and it's very clear that for the most part, the people upon the syndicate are interested in maintaining a status quo that may not be great, but are not megalomaniacs. They want business and life to proceed apace.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Lolorito is an interesting character, a very complex character in himself, much more so than I first gave him credit for when playing, 2.x.
Well, when playing 2.x, I think up until that point, you've seen relatively straight-faced villains and characters, so you could be forgiven for assuming he'd be yet one more.
Yes.
So talking about Thorne and the growth he brought to Ul'dah during his reign, why don't we actually get back onto the timeline where we left off during early Thanalan, which would have been right as the Thorne dynasty came to be.
Right, exactly. So the Thorne dynasty, they rise out of Ul'dah's darkest day, or at least one of its darkest days. As described in the previous law talks on pre-Ul'dah Thanalan, the reigning Sultan of Ul'dah, Sasagun, had destroyed Sil'dih using the calamitously dangerous toxin, the Traitor's Spurn, which causes the dead to rise and attack the living. He managed to successfully destroy Sil'dih with this and win the War of the Sisters, or well, one of the many wars that spawned out of it, for once and for all, in fact. But a nobleman, a Midlander, so a Hyr nobleman by the name of Baldur Thorne, found out about this and was outraged. He went before the Sultan and decried him, insulted him, told him that what he'd done was evil, and the Sultan orders him to be murdered, to be executed. But the acts of the Sultan had so offended the court and even what appears to be perhaps the Sultan sworn, or maybe just the military at that point, and they join Baldur in a coup, deposing the Sultan and imprisoning him. Baldur is then pushed onto the throne, essentially. He doesn't seem to be intentional for it. You know, the victors write the histories, so we can't really know how genuine that is, but it seems from all the sources we have that aren't extremely biased, that he was persuaded to take the throne as opposed to taking it on his own initiative. He immediately vowed to return it to the Ul'dah dynasty when the time was right, however, and he began to turn Ul'dah into a mercantile society. There is some evidence that early Ul'dah and Belodaya were also mercantile, also had great riches, but this is when it really starts. The Ul'dah that we see today, where everything is dominated by economics and trade, this is where it's really born. He purchases an entire race of slaves, probably not his finest moment.
That's one way to frame it.
Yeah. The Hectonkeres from the Gigants, who had enslaved them in Abalathia's spine from their own kin, and puts them to work in capital mines, using magical bindings to keep them sort of in line. Eventually, these bindings fail, and his regime seals them down in the mines to prevent them from staging any sort of rebellion.
And they were never heard from again.
Yeah, a pretty horrendous thing to do on several levels. Baldur is probably a Stannis Baratheon type character. He's probably good by sort of medieval honor standards. He doesn't seem to be a good person by modern moral standards, though, but that's sort of part of this setting.
You can even look to his relationship with his daughter and see some... you can look to Stannis' relationship with Shireen, and it's very similar to Baldur.
Yeah, I think that's true. I definitely think there are comparisons to be drawn between these sort of unflinching men of honor that you see portrayed in fantasy all the time, and in historical, content all the time as well. That maybe we would judge perhaps as less than moral paragons in our own day.
Or and even another way to think of it in some ways is that they are the extremes of lawful neutral, or within their own perspective lawful good, but to such an extreme point that you wouldn't maybe categorize it as such within the world we have now.
I think true neutral or lawful neutral, probably lawful neutral are a good one to sort of categorize there.
An upholding of the rules to an extreme extent.
Yes, definitely. So do we want to talk about the Little Lady's Day story?
How can we not? It's a wonderful little tale. It
is a wonderful little tale. So, a sultan, a Thorne sultan, Baldric or Baldur, had a single daughter, Edvia Thorne. Now, I'm not entirely sure how to say that name, but that's what I'm going with, whom he cherished. In fact, he cherished her a little too much. His love was overly protective, and he kept her under lock and key in the palace. But her interest in the outside just grew and grew, and eventually she came across a miller's daughter who was delivering grain to the palace with her father, and exchanged clothes with her and slipped into the city. The moment the Sultan discovered that the daughter was missing, he mobilized the army to find her and harshly punished the miller and his family, thinking that they'd kidnapped her.
Even burning down their house.
Yeah, burning down their house, imprisoning them in shackles, very, very harsh treatment. I mean, perhaps understandable if you actually believe that, but of course that was not the case.
The fact that she would have gone to market, though, means that all of this would have happened in a few hours span of time.
Yeah, a very short period of time. And like you said, she was in the market and she's found pretty quickly and returned to the palace, and she pled with her father to release the poor family. Baldric was bitterly ashamed of the way that he treated the Millers, and he's sort of spoken of in the histories as a very unflinching and even tyrannical ruler. But in this moment, he displays, much like either Baldulf, as we've seen him previously, or Baldulf as his father, he begins to show this sense of honor, and he frees the Millers, reimburses them for their destroyed possessions, and has his royal architects build them a house. Then he vows to become the seneschal of the daughter for a day, stating that no young woman, regardless of her standing, should be denied the respect due all citizens of the Sultanate, that all girls, common or noble, are ladies in their own right. So essentially serving as a royal escort to her for an entire day. And this made him much, much more popular than he was previously. So both because of the small folks' fascination with this and because of the positive effect it had for the Sultanate, the tradition continued from then on, with it becoming sort of an official celebration where a randomly chosen girl was sort of placed at the center with the Sultan as her seneschal every year.
Yeah, and you even see it on to today. And also, as well, you get to, at least it used to be, not every year does it do this, but many years it is facilitated by a descendant of the Thorne dynasty in Ul'dah. I wouldn't necessarily call it an unambiguous victory, but I would call that one of maybe the more highlight moments of the Thorne dynasty in contrast to some of the other things they deal with, like the Hecaton Kyries.
Yes.
But they also then have to deal with some of the sins of the past with the flood of the Sil'dih undead later on.
Yes. So as we mentioned in the previous video, the Thorne dynasty move Ul'dah onto the site of Old Sil'dih in 1270. So I believe that's only a few decades after Sil'dih is destroyed. And unfortunately, in the short term, this proves to be a very poor idea. It might in the long term have paid dividends, but in the short term, it's pretty disastrous because they hadn't cleared out the sewers of Sil'dih, which are still teeming with undead. And a little under a century after Ul'dah is moved on to Sil'dih, they break out of the sewers and flood the city, very nearly destroying the state, it seems. It's only when the Thorns turn to outside help and hire mercenaries from Alamigo, and even turn to the Al-Maljar and sort of ask for their help, who of course they had been enemies with since the days of Beladaya, that they are able to quell the strife and protect Ul'dah. The Al-Maljar only agree to this because they believe that Thanalan is sacred to Ifrit, and that the undead were profaning it and dirtying it by being present. If only they knew that Ul'dah had created the undead in the first place, they might be less forgiving.
Desperation breeds strange bedfellows, that's for sure.
Right. I mean, we see that plenty in Final Fantasy XIV.
Yeah. For as important as the Thorne dynasty is, especially for this interregnum period, it may be the most momentous thing that they do is the actual giving back of rule to the Ul line.
Yes, so this is profoundly surprising, of course, especially in a culture such as Uldah's. We see it happen in history occasionally. Of course, until Julius Caesar, all of the dictators of the Roman Republic gave back the sort of dictator position to the Senate. It was only Julius Caesar that seized power and began the monarchy again. But the Thorns willingly give Ul'dah back to the Old Dynasty, sometimes called the Second Old Dynasty, after quelling the undead. Pretty much, I think it's praises very, very quickly after dealing with the undead. Safe in the belief, or at least claiming to be safe in the belief, that the city-state was ready to welcome back its former rulers. This is a startlingly selfless act to me. Or perhaps it's just the example of an isolated monarch who didn't want to be a ruler and decided to hand it back.
Which we have precedents for within the desert with people like Lalafuta III.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there are monarchs in the history of Ul'dah who want to give up their regnal essence, I suppose. That was a weird way to phrase it.
One of the ironies, though, is that as noble of it's not really a sacrifice, but as noble as an act as that is, one of the early situations in which the Old Dynasty finds itself is one of maybe its more outwardly tragic with the sins of Sasimo.
Yes. So a few decades after Ul'dah is given back to the Old Dynasty, there is a tragic situation. Now, a great deal of people may not know the truth of it in universe, or at least not the full truth, but a Ul'dah princess a sister of the Sultana named Sasimo Ul'Samo, was ruling. Well, sorry, not ruling. Her sister was ruling about 2 centuries before modern day, and the story of her life, as seen by the Ul'dah populace, is that she plotted to overthrow her sister, the Sultana, and take the throne for herself in collusion with the remnants of the Thorne dynasty. Sasimo's plot was, finger brackets, discovered, however, and she was thrown into the Marasaja pit, the most heinous of all of Uldah's dungeons. And Sasimo is charged with 80 crimes. And in order to punish her sister, the Sultana demands that she descends and ascends the 80 steps outside Uldah's western gate 80 times a day for 80 days, reciting one of her crimes with each step taken. As the princess, who is of course a Lalafell, and thus not suited to climbing lofty stairs for long periods of time in the boiling sun, the people of Ul'dah gather to torment her and to, very Cersei in Game of Thrones, to throw jibes at her, to mock her for her crimes. But over time, they began to see her determination and her humbleness, and eventually they stop shouting, they stop jeering, and they become silent witnesses to the event. And eventually, after that, they start to cheer for her. They're so sort of invested in her journey. The sheer exhaustion of this act, however, is too much for Sasimo, and on her 80th and final day, she collapsed and died of fatigue. The people of Ul'dah carried her for the rest of her circuits of the stairs, concluding her punishment and absolving her of her crime. The Sultana publicly fell into grief and commuted her sister's sentence, seeing how popular she was, naming the steps that she'd climbed for her fallen kin. I believe calling them the Steps of Sasimo at the time. We then find in Universe a number of sources, including the Diary of Sasimo, which was found relatively recently in history, that dispute the tale. They imply that Sasimo's advisors, under the threat and sort of cajolement of her jealous and paranoid sister, made this plot up wholesale to frame her. And then this is sort of further buoyed by the fact that the advisors soon disappear. They only receive very, very light jail sentences, or they are given the chance to move away to other city-states after this happens.
And while not many, I don't even think it's years, but a short period of time later, the Sasimo renames the steps the Sins of Sasimo. So she's clearly not very particularly upset, and clearly it was still vindictive to some level.
Right, so the forces of the Sultana of Sasimo, like you said, they immediately, in fact, deny pilgrims and mourners access to the stairs. Obviously, they can still come and go up the stairs, but they're not allowed to sort of stand there and hold vigils for Sasimo. And like you said, a few years after, they change it from the 80 steps of Sasimo to the 80 sins of Sasimo, which is, of course, entirely incongruous with the Sultana's absolution of her sister, and really just drives the nail home in how much this was a spiteful, horrible, jealous effort.
Yeah, and probably the most heartbreaking thing is how few of the people of the populace actually know the truth.
Yes, it's absolutely tragic. And it's one of many tragic things that happen in Ul'dah, and are swept under the rug. Of course, you have the Hekatoncheires, you have Sasimo, you have the treatment of the Alamegan refugees. Ul'dah is a state with great baggage.
Yeah. Well, and the larger issues around tribes, and it's maybe not surprising that the inception for the idea of the term beast tribes and the use of it starts in Ul'dah, though it is propagated and quickly taken up by everyone else.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
So the period that follows is kind of marked by the rise of groups like the Amagina Mineral Concerns and the Mad Mithril Rush and events like that.
Right, exactly. And this is where one of Uldah's true strength arises, because instead of simply acting as a crafting hub, which they certainly were, and a center for trade, they find their own wealth in their mineral wealth. The Amagina and Sons Mineral Concern is founded by Amagina, believe it or not, who's a humble landlady of a tavern. She owns a tavern in Ul'dah. And she goes on to found a business run by herself, employing her essentially her barflies. And she develops this into Eorzea's foremost mining company, and nowadays a member of Ul'dah's syndicate. They have vast control over Thanalan's considerable mineral wealth. They also seem to run the rail systems in Ul'dah, which are limited but do exist. And they even, like the syndicate as a whole, have their own private army known as the Stone Torches.
Yeah, and much like the Brass Blades, they occupy a very interesting place in that while the Brass Blades are on one end of the spectrum of technically part of the Royalists, but also functionally a mercenary group. The Stone Torches are technically a mercenary group, but also end up acting as a pseudo police force and part of aiding the surrounding land as well.
Yeah, the Stone Torches seem decidedly more moral than the Brass Blades, but perhaps that's just because more limelight is given to the Brass Blades and their sins.
Yeah, the Brass Blades are, much like Ul'dah itself, their morality is contentious, maybe not on an individual level, but as a whole, because there are those within who are sincere and those less so.
Yeah, there are definitely some sincere.
Yeah. So yeah, the Mad Mithril Rush takes place, but then probably the main event that is a major historical point for Eorzea as a whole, or at least Aldenard, that most people have no idea it exists if you play 14, is the Autumn War.
Right. So this is the reason that people are so reticent to support Alamigo at first, or at least one of the reasons, combined with their fear of Garlemald. So the Autumn War is not, in fact, an Ul'dah war at first, at least. It's an Alamigan invasion of Gridania. The Alamigan military, unprovoked, essentially. I'm sure they had their casus belli, but mostly unprovoked, march into Gridania. And despite stiff resistance, begin to really win the war. They're largely successful until the first shadow of what would go on to become the Eorzean alliance arises. Ishgard, Ul'dah, and Limsa all come together to support Gridania and send their own armies to the Shroud. They join forces with the Gridanians and deal a crippling defeat to the Alamegans at the Battle of East End, killing their general, their premier general, and wounding their monarch as well, killing the king of Alamigo. They then press the advantage, defeating the nation at the Second Battle of Tinochla. Hold on. How do I say that word? Tinolka, there you go, that word. And defeat the nation conclusively at the Second Battle of Tinolka, and sort of end the Autumn War, although there are years of negotiations, it seems, after this for how to sort of put it to rest. And just like the Guardians did, the Alamegans seem to get the Treaty of Versailles a little bit in this resolution.
I was just about to make that same analogy.
Yeah, it's, obviously Gridania particularly has been through quite a lot at the hands of Alamigo at this point, so their vengeance is perhaps understandable, but it helps nobody in the long run.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Autumn War is that if you removed from the battle at Cartnau, the fall of Dalamud, it's not so much that there's specific parallels between those fights, but the level to which the Autumn War is a fundamental part of the 6th Astral Era's history and is really vital to understanding the city-states and their relations that come in, especially during the 7th Astral Era, is kind of fascinating because it's only really talked about in Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1. A few side quests primarily in the Shroud here or there with an oblique reference, and I believe the Bard Job questline, correct?
Yes. The Bard questline, I believe, does mention it in a historical sense, of course, not like not in a personal sense, but
no,
it is
because this was hundreds of years ago.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a crucial part of Eorzean history, not just Ul'dah history, not just even Ishgardian history. It's hugely important. This is the reason that the Eorzean alliance is able to form so easily. This is the reason that many people are so resentful to a degree, or so reluctant to assist Alamigo. It is a really significant event, and it is not talked about particularly much in the game.
Well, it's also interesting tying back into Nim, Mach, and Amdapor, how a lot of its ideas were also rooted in the Grand Company of those groups during the beginning of the 6th Umbral Calamity.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a line to be drawn there with this sort of international collaboration aspect and this desperate last-ditch attempt to defend against an imperial power / a disaster.
From geopolitics to more technological innovations, right at the end of the Autumn Wars, where we also begin to see the beginnings of technically not flight in Eorzea, as the Ixali had already been working on that and were the sort of initiators of that technology, but the adoption of it by, I won't say Eorzeans because the Ixali are Eorzeans, the adoption of it by the city-states.
Right. So the face of Eorzean travel changes pretty much entirely in the year of 1481, when the Ul'dah merchant by the name of Tatanora buys a downed Ixali dirigible, so they're sort of like air balloon type situations, from Gridania, and studies the technology and the sort of etheric things within, and uses it to create, at first, floating chocobo carriages, which are important. We see them nowadays, of course, for travel and for cargo.
Frictionless carts are quite handy. I mean, it's a priceless piece of innovation. The other part of that, though, is that with the adoption of that technology, at that point, neither the Ixali nor Tatanora have any means of propulsion. So it's relatively limited.
Yes, it's very limited. And actually, when you mentioned the frictionless cargo transport, that's actually something that plays into my own life, because I come from a town in England that was founded pretty much entirely to serve as a canal hub for pottery. So, of course, carts aren't suitable for large pottery shipments. So you make canal networks to transport it to more sort of stable areas, because, of course, a canal boat isn't experiencing the rough conditions of a road. So, yeah, I mean, I can speak to how important an innovation like that would be.
That's super cool. Well, it's glad, yet one more example of the ways in which 14 can tie back into the real world.
Yeah, definitely. But like you said, the innovation at this point, although important, is not the revelation that we see nowadays. It takes many decades. Tatanora seems to be quite a long-lived man, actually. He lives for many decades after he invents these cards.
And his progeny goes on to even further build on that.
Yeah, his progeny, of course, is still around today in the form of Highwind Skyways. Though he finally, after decades and decades of work, perfects his reverse engineering of the airships and innovation of them, and creates the first flying transports of Eorzean make, but they're very limited. They're essentially kind of hot air balloons. You use them for leisure trips, but they're not really used for cargo yet. But Highwind Skyways is a company that he founds around this, and of course, nowadays it is largely responsible for overseeing a number of the airship flights that we see. With now that the innovations of Sid and the gradual plod forward in Eorzea through technology sort of have made proper airships available on the continent.
It's worth noting that we've highly truncated a lot of the story around the creation of airships and where that comes from, and Tatanora's relationship with the Ixali, and that is worth looking into on your own time, as well as I'm sure we will cover it in the future. But just know that there is a very interesting dynamic and relationship going on there that also builds into the next thing I would want to touch on, which is the banning of tribes from Ul'dah and the creation of the notion of a beast tribe. Because as much as there had been friction with tribal groups and the Eorzean city-states up to that point, especially, I mean, you look at Lenosia's relationship with the Sahagin and Kobolds, for instance, or even the Ixali and Gridania. This is a codifying of of othering that up to this point hasn't existed in that exact way.
Right, it's a horribly cruel thing. So the Syndicate, and it is the Syndicate that's responsible for this, not to say that many other people were not complicit, but they create the label of Beast Tribe almost entirely out of nothing in the year 1559. Now, I'm sure that they built on existing prejudice to do so, but this label seems to be entirely of their own making.
And it's not only is it of their own making, but it's very clear. It's so implicit in multiple sources that it's basically explicit that it was intended to be used as a manipulation tool of garnering resource lands, all sorts of benefit for them. So there's no shadow of a doubt that it's not even just prejudice, but it is also greed. On top of that, like you say, this is 1559. this is not even 20 years before the fall of the Dalamud. Literally, the events of the fall of Dalamud would be in, 1577, basically?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So this is not even 20 years ago. This is within living memory by people who are in their 20s.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really shocking thing. So the first ones that are labeled beast tribes are the Ul'dah, because for obvious reasons, they were the ancestral enemies of Ul'dah. But also the goblins, the Quicarian, and the sylphs, of all people, because they were trading peoples, and the Uldans, for all their talk of free enterprise, or at least the syndicate, refused to permit such competition to their interests. And so this went on to spawn, at the encouragement of the syndicate, widespread discrimination, seemingly across the globe, which, I'm sure existed before, but it really provides this legal tool to nations and to groups to sort of suppress and express discrimination against these tribes.
Yeah, and then the idea spreads like wildfire throughout the greater region of Eorzea and seemingly beyond into other lands, though I would assume that the notion of savages or beast tribes, the way that the Garleans use it, is actually not necessarily a byproduct of garnering that from Eorzean culture, and is actually more just part of their imperial mindset and developed within Garlemald itself.
I would think so, yes. And they simply adopted the term for certain groups as they came to Eorzea. But I would not be surprised to hear that Lolorito maybe had a hand in entrenching the subject in the Far East, particularly in Hingashi and those types of areas.
It's also a question too of who uses it, because we know we use that terminology, but I do not know if there's an Easterner who specifically does.
Oh, is there not? I thought there might have been.
There might be. I mean this merely in I can speak to it in either way, but I don't have a strong. I can't point to a specific character that I recall using it, and therefore that would be worth investigating.
Right.
So as a byproduct of this, though, and the excising of goblins and Ul'dah and all the different tribal groups, not only do we get conflicts like what the goblin fate, where the goblins are trying to beat up on the Hammerleia, is that's a byproduct of things like this. But importantly, this is where you start to see things like Ifrit first show up as a, not singularly, but as partially a byproduct of this othering and this excising.
Right. So Ifrit the god, of course, is very old, and Ifrit the being might be way older. We discussed that, of course, previously before. But like we said before, the Ul'dah have been at war with Ul'dah for centuries. They were always Belediah, but it was not until 1564, after this act, that the Ascians come to them and teach them summoning magics. And they almost immediately summon Ifrit and set the primal on what else but an Ul'dah mine, probably lashing out at the syndicate. Ifrit, of course, destroys the mine, and almost immediately causes additional issues as the Ul'dah begin to march on Ul'dah as this happens, and the Circle of Knowing discovers that the primals were leeching aether, and of course the first tempered of Ul'dah begin to appear at this time.
Yes, and that becomes, the primary issue not only of 2.0 but also 1.0 as well. And we're fast approaching basically all the events that surround 1.0 and Final Fantasy XIV as you would play it if you began now.
Yeah, we do.
If anything, the really final incident that happens in the same time span is really the Gubu incident of the parade in Ul'dah and Minfilia's loss of her father, which, it's this interesting thing where that is an important moment in Uldah's history because of its relation to Path of the 12, right? The Circle of Knowing and what comes next. But it's also something that, as a player, you're more intimately and personally familiar with.
Yes. This is one of the few sins that was not committed by a monarch or by the syndicate in the history of Ul'dah, at least not directly. We, in fact, see this centered on a youngish Philamen Kesh and her lover, Neil Frez. Oh gosh, how are we going to say that? How do you say that word?
You make your best guess and you pray to whatever god you believe in. That's how you do it.
Okay. And her lover, Neil Fresne. No, I'm not good at pronouncing that, but you're going to have to stick with me. Neil Frez, I'm going to just say that, Thodor. Now, these two, Philamen is a noted songstress, and Thodor, I'm going to start referring to him by his surname, is a goldsmith of some note, and he is made responsible for managing a grand parade throughout the city. and they plan to release a number of wild beasts in the parade before personally stopping them to make themselves heroes in the eyes of the people. It's sort of this grind that you see throughout all of the peoples of Ul'dah, or many of them. Unfortunately, they fail. They cannot control the beast that escapes, Gubu, like you said, which kills a man called Warburton, who later turns out to be an Alamegan spy of Garlemald. A double agent. His true allegiance was still with Alamigo, but he was a spy for Garlemald, ostensibly. Falamin adopts this man's daughter, then known as Asilia, who would later go on to become Minfilia Ward, the antecedent of the Circle of Knowing and of the science of the Seventh Thorne. The tragedy doesn't stop there, of course. Her boyfriend, her lover, is slain by an unknown assassin using a blade called Heartsbane. Yes, I'm trying not to say the name.
You couldn't help but mention it.
One of the many lingering plot threads from 1.0 that has never been addressed, okay, that's not entirely fair, because his corpse and Heartsbane has been addressed, but who murdered him and more specifically why has not been fully ever clarified.
No, that's something that we need to see at some point, and I'm sure that now that we are being given the chance to sort of refocus on local issues, we will see that now, or begin to see that. She and the young girl, Asilia, bond over their shared tragedy, over Falamin's loss of her lover and over Asilia/Minfilia's loss of her father, and eventually Falamin Kesh becomes the mother of Asilia, the adoptive mother.
Only to find other heartbreak in the future.
Yes, tragically so.
Having kind of caught up to the modern point, I think we're probably best served then diving into some of the more specifics of Ul'dah, but also one of the major characters we have yet to really talk about, and that is Nanamo, the current Sultana, and her role both in Ul'dah currently and over the past 20 years.
Yes. So, Sultana Nanamo Ul'Namo is the current Sultana of Ul'dah, of course. Everyone knows that. Just as a note, the reason that the Ul is the middle name instead of the surname is because pretty much all Lalafella names observe the name condition, so they can't have hereditary surnames. So the royal family takes a middle name instead. Her father was Sultan Sasibal ul Sisibal, and her mother was Sultana Nanasha ul Nasha. Now, I'm not entirely certain if that means that they were related or that she took the surname or took the name. Royal families can be that way at times. I'm kind of hoping that they weren't, but you never know.
I feel like if we look to examples like Lalafuto and stuff, which I realize is far before this point in history, but I would assume that it is not just marrying within the royal line.
Yes, yeah, I would imagine.
There's just not enough of them either.
Yes. So Nanamo becomes the Sultana on her fifth, when she was 5, when her parents tragically die while traveling abroad. Now, Nanamo, of course, is a young child at this point, and her regency essentially loses all royal authority for the monarchy, because the Syndicate become essentially regents for her and are thus able to finish their not coup, because it's not really a coup, but their quiet sort of background coup of the city-state.
Yeah, they're effectively in control for this period of time. And it doesn't necessarily seem that things change that drastically, which potentially could be a condemnation, but they are, even really onto the events of A Realm Reborn, still the primary source of power.
And I would even say, yeah, past that they become, at the very least, 50% of the power.
Yes, agreed. But it is at least less of a utter dominance, which is a part of Nanamo's story, and understanding the position she was put in at her youth, and the way in which she has had to rise not only to the challenges of her own nation state, but the conflicts in the wider world. You can, in some ways, be empathetic towards her.
Oh, certainly. I think Nanamo's a sympathetic figure. I think her desire to implement democracy is very, very laudable. And I would say that her journey to gaining some power begins when she frees Raubahn.
Yes, which we should talk about. Her right hand, and a figure of some import to multiple city-states and upon this world stage of Eorzea, Raubahn, Ul'dah.
Yes, and to the greatest extreme trial of Stormblood.
For those of you who don't know, you should go look up Raubahn Extreme.
You definitely should. So Raubahn is Alamigan. He's not Ul'dah. He's born in the impoverished hamlet of Coldhearth, and he joins the military at a young age because he, of course, wants to escape this life of poverty. But when he's still fairly young, I think he's in his early 20s, Alamigo falls to the Garleans, and he finds himself in Ul'dah, where he is falsely accused of being a Garlean spy, which seems random.
Some paranoia going on at the time.
Certainly, in a similar sort of breed to Warburton, I suppose. And he was given the chance to earn his freedom through combat in the Blood Sands, where he earned a name for himself as a peerless warrior. The fighting style that he uses is blade dancing, which is an Alamigan discipline. And he becomes extremely successful, extremely famous, and eventually the young Sultana Nanamo takes mercy on him. She pardons him. Now, this has knock-on effects. He's so successful that when he is made entitled to all of his winnings, because he's now free from his many years in the arena, he's in there for quite some time, his success makes him fabulously wealthy. In fact, so wealthy that he is promptly able to purchase the Colosseum, which is one of Uldah's oldest standing and probably most lucrative properties.
Yeah, well, and ironically, perhaps, maybe one of its less morally ambiguous. Like, as much as there are people who try to fix matches, it like the culture around it and the structure, the organizational structure around it actually works quite hard to keep it pretty fair.
I mean, it's fair. You could definitely have an argument for erasing the judicial side of it, sentencing people to the Blood Sands.
Yes, no, okay, but yes, absolutely. The byproduct of its uses may be less morally.
So he becomes a member of the Syndicate because he's now so wealthy and he owns a major chunk of Ul'dah by holding the Blood Sands. Pretty soon after that, he and Nanamo become the center of the royalist faction. There are some other members of the Syndicate that lean towards them. Dulala is ostensibly neutral, but seems to have royalist sentiment.
Yes, very well. At the very least, she, more than any of the other members of the Syndicate, tries to keep an air of maintaining both sides, not just for self. My read is not necessarily just for her the benefit of groups like the Order of Nalthal, but also it seems to be ideologically in the belief that that is the best way to maintain Ul'dah's prosperity.
Right, exactly. So he and Nanamo at some point enter. Those two are responsible for convincing the Syndicate to let them create the Mortal Flames Grand Company. He's a hugely important figure. Of course, he's no longer present within the hierarchy of Ul'dah as of modern day in the MSQ, but he is his influence cannot be overstated.
It truly can't. Well, and building off that, why don't we talk about organizations like the Colosseum, the Syndicate members that maybe we didn't touch on as much, or the Order of Nalthal, as they play fundamental parts, not just of Ul'dah, but the greater Thanalan area, with relationships for the Colosseum to places like Hydaelyn, or relationships to Nalthal as a whole for the Order of Nalthal.
Okay, so just to mention who is in the Syndicate right now, not to belabor the point, but you've got Lolarito, who is the chairman of the East Aldanard Trading Company, the sort of premier overland and oversea mercantile organization, perhaps in all of Eorzea. You've got Teleji Adeleji, who is no longer there, of course, in modern day, but who ran the Mirage Trust, which was a banking clan and ran a number of gambling halls. You got Firgis, who is the current leader of the Amagina and Sons Mineral Concern. And
funnily enough, has a Seawolf name, but is a Hellsguard Rogadin.
That is interesting, isn't it? I wonder if he has mixed heritage.
I mean, his adoptive sons are Lalafels, so at this point, anything's possible.
I love his adoptive sons. That's great.
They're great.
You've got Raubahn, of course, who led the Immortal Flames, and I'm not sure if he still owns the Blood Sands. Perhaps he does. Perhaps Pippin owns it now. Who knows? You've got Dulala, who is the leader of the Order of Nalthal. Now, you may be thinking, I thought that was the Black Mage Guild leader. Not quite. So, Dulala is the ultimate leader of the Order, but there are two churches, essentially, in Ul'dah. There's the Milvaneth Sacarium, which is the one that she leads and has been sort of closed to the public since 1.0 because it was damaged severely in the Calamity. And then you've got the one that we see, the Azraneth, is it?
Yes.
Which has the guild in it.
The Azraneth Ossuary.
Yes, and that's the one that is led by the guild leader, but they seem to be subordinate to Dulala ultimately.
It seems to be that Dulala is very much the one responsible for the political maneuverings and power base of the Order of Nalthal, whereas the Ossuary seems more about the esoteric, the magics, the accrual of knowledge, the more fundamental tenets of what they're supposed to be about that isn't the specific religious practices.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, you've got the leader of Mandeville and Mandeville, Godbert Mandeville, who is actually did not make all of his money through the Golden Saucer. He made all of his money through... Yeah, he was a jeweler, and specifically someone who used to go around and kill wild monsters to get really exotic materials for his jewelry.
Yeah, and that makes up the primary power base. There are some other members that we either don't really know anything about or are not of consequence functionally.
Yeah, I sort of conceptualize the Syndicate as a wider body, but the group that we interface with are mostly sort of a ruling board, perhaps.
Yes, that is absolutely my impression as well. As Raubah's part of the Syndicate and owns the Colosseum also being a major moneymaker is just tied to Ul'dah's culture. It's tied to its wealth, at least on a local level. So why don't we dive into a bit about its culture?
Right, okay. So the Colosseum of Ul'dah is built, the first one, not the current one, is built around the year 1100 of the 6th Astral Era, and is later moved into the new city above Old Sil'dih when the Thorne dynasty moves the nation. So it's very, very old. It's pre-Thorne. And the Blood Sands, as they're commonly called, went on to grow in popularity over time, receiving pretty huge merchant investment in 1481, big enough to buy Hydaelyn, which is sort of an ancient Marquis site, proto-Belladine site, and use it as a training facility for gladiators. The martial culture that the Colosseum stems from is actually birthed from the importation of Rogadin and Highlander mercenaries. It seems to be their cultures that sort of found this tradition and then later become a part of Ul'dah.
Yeah, not only is it relevant to the history of mercenaries and other combat people, and all sorts of members of the populace try to earn wealth or glory, whether from desperation, or dreams, but it is in part run by and tied to the Gladiators Guild.
Right. So the Gladiators Guild seems to be it's essentially a union. Perhaps is not the best term, but perhaps it is.
I think it's accurate.
It's fairly accurate, isn't it? Yeah. So for the members of the fighting population of both of the Blood Sands, that they also seem to have sort of a mercenary grouping within them, but the gladiators are probably have been somewhat contiguously within the organization, of course, since its founding, though I don't believe that they found a guild until much later. And then, of course, there is a spin-off guild, the Pugilists. So the Pugilists actually are very, very recent. So they only spin off in 1520, when the gladiator Cornelia organizes the sort of unarmed, specifically the unarmed combatants of the Blood Sands, into a guild, the Pugilists, sort of aimed at codifying training, advancing their art, supporting them in the Blood Sands. Cornelia herself was a furiously powerful martial artist, just like the current guildmaster, Hamon the Holy Fist, was. He's now, I believe, about 70 years old, so obviously not such a mighty combatant on an everyday basis, but a hugely influential teacher and leader amongst the pugilists, despite his maybe slightly less socially acceptable character traits.
That's fair. The interesting thing about the pugilist and gladiators guilds is also the way they filter into the other disciplines surrounding them, and the way those disciplines are tied to the certain city states. So you have the way in which pugilists become monks, and how monks are tied into Alamigo, which is its own conversation and important. But very interestingly is the way in which it seems that often the Sultana Sworn are recruited from members of the Gladiators Guild.
Yeah, which makes sense, of course, because they are, they are fine warriors, and of course, Ul'dah didn't have a military until the Immortal Flames are refounded. The Thorne dynasty abolishes their military.
Part of why mercenaries are so important.
Exactly. So they can't, the sultans probably aren't raring to recruit their personal bodyguards from, the lapdogs of the syndicate. So it would make much more sense for them to approach the Gladiators Guild. And I think the link between the pugilists and the monks is fascinating because, of course, like we said, the martial legacy of the Colosseum is founded in part by Alamegan mercenaries. So perhaps there are a few monks among them, and the Pugilists Guild nowadays represents sort of a watering down or a different direction that their martial arts took.
Well, and it's somewhat beautiful how there's a full circle, right? They bring it to Ul'dah, and then Ul'dah brings it back to Alamigo. If we think of ourselves as an avatar of that. I mentioned the Sultana Sworn just now. I mean paladins, but the thing is you can be a free agent paladin or a Sultana Sworn paladin. So just saying you would have to be in the service of the Sultana Sworn to be a paladin is not correct.
No. So the Sultan Sworn, like we discussed in the last video, are founded very early on in Ul'dah history, but are very different nowadays. Nowadays you have non-Sultan Sworn paladins, essentially. These free agent paladins who devote themselves to improving life for people all over the place.
You also just touched on the Immortal Flames, which we hit up near the top, but we should probably delve on a little bit more, as they're a really fundamental part not only of the military, they are basically the military of Ul'dah, but then also become part and parcel to the the larger grand companies of Eorzea.
Right, exactly. So the Immortal Flames they're actually named for an ancient Ul'dah infantry unit that was abolished by the Thorne dynasty, like the rest of the military. And it really displays Raubahn's cultural acumen, political acumen, as well as his military acumen, because he picks this name to draw upon Ul'dah patriotism, so that the syndicate doesn't have much choice but to accept their calls to form this grand company. Now, the Flames in their core are the least numerous of the grand companies, but they are probably the most elite, and they actually aren't the least numerous because they have the ability to call upon the Sultan Sworn and the Stone Torches and the Brass Blades when needed to sort of boost their numbers up quite a bit.
Yeah, you have groups like the Yellow Jackets with Lenosia to, in some ways aid the Maelstorms, but Ul'dah has a much wider breadth of options going on.
Yeah, I read the Brass Blades as a very, very numerous organization.
Yeah, they literally have enough to have different names for their different garrisons in the different regions of Thanalan. So I absolutely agree with that.
Yes, and like you said, I kind of see the Immortal Flames as forming almost a core for the Eorzean Alliance's forces. Raubahn certainly seems to have been if not the official overall commander of military operations for the Alliance, a very prominent one.
Yeah, he is definitely at least the figurehead of battle, in my opinion. Yeah. So to cap this all off, why don't we talk about what is essentially the figurehead, or at least maybe sort of fundamental symbol and deity of Ul'dah, and that's Nalthal.
Right, so the twin god/gods of Ul'dah are the traders. It's a deity made up out of the brothers Nald, who's god of life, and Thal, the god of death. Together they make almost a composite god that is both singular and plural at the same time, who is patron of the underworld and of commerce, and represented by a cowrie shell, like we've mentioned previously, and is associated with the element of fire, just like Azema was. Now, it's not immediately obvious where the worship of Nalthal began in Ul'dah, as Beledai was devoted to Azema instead, but it's plausible that the traders were pretty prominent in Beledai as well, as secondary deities, because we see the symbol of a set of scales all across Beledai ruins, which makes sense because it's a staple of Nalthal's imagery. This paired with the extensive influence of the Order of Nalthal, which seemed to have been a powerful organization for quite some time, and Ul'dah shifting increasingly to this plutocratic, mercantile aspect, might have ensured this ascendancy. I did have a theory that I came up with while writing this, actually.
Yeah, do tell.
So the theory is that pre-Thorne dynasty Ul'dah might have been devoted to Azema. You might say, or you maybe not you, but some people might say, well, why don't we see temples or relics of Azema in the city? Well, because the city of Ul'dah is not the old pre-Thorne city of Ul'dah.
Right.
We don't know where that is. It was moved, of course, to Sil'dih.
Well, another interesting twist on that would be the idea that what if Azema was the worshipped deity of Ul'dah before the conquering of Sil'dih, and Sil'dih's chosen deity was Nalthal, and taking that was also part and parcel of them. Not only was it enough to conquer the literal bedrock of their city, but to also take their deity from them.
Yeah, it's possible to harp on about Egypt, real life Egypt, a bit more. When the Ptolemies, of course, invade. When Alexander invades Egypt, and then the Ptolemies, one of his Greek generals, take over and become the new pharaohs of Egypt after the fall of his empire. They adopt a hybrid religion involving their Egyptian gods and the Greek gods, and sort of fusing them together. So there's a real world basis based out of nations that Ul'dah is based on for that as well.
Yeah, and either way, the fact that Nalthal is representational of Ul'dah is really, it makes a lot of sense with its connections with not just trade in a sense that, yes, business, but trade also kind of represents life in Ul'dah, and in some ways in Thanalan, but in Ul'dah, and so Nalthal makes so much sense for it as a deity.
Yes. Oh, yeah. He makes a huge amount of sense, of course. As well, we love every piece of engagement that you give us. We really love when you reach out, or you just comment, or even if you just give us a watch or a like.
And with that usual YouTube baggage out of the way, I've been Elio Fosheron.
I've been a Neri.
Thanks so much for watching, guys.
Thank you.
This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday. And comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.